The forest is alive, but not with the usual sounds of nature. It's the quiet that strikes first, the oppressive silence that feels like the trees themselves are holding their breath. Then, in the corner of my eye, I see its shadowy legs moving unnaturally through the mist, impossibly quick, yet eerily graceful. Burning eyes pierce through the darkness, unblinking, filled with a malevolence I can't escape. It doesn't just stalk me, it feels like it's drawing me deeper, into a part of the forest where no one ever returns. The forest is a maze of towering trees and unyielding shadows, their limbs reaching out like claws to trap those who wander too far. It begins innocently enough, a walk to clear the mind, a journey into nature to escape the chaos of everyday life. But this forest is not ordinary. Here, the silence carries a weight, and the air feels heavy, as though thickened by an unseen presence. At first, it's just a sound, the faintest rustle of leaves, though the wind is completely still. Then, a shadow flickers at the edge of vision, so fast it's almost imperceptible. The forest seems to close in, the paths twisting unnaturally. No matter which direction one turns, the feeling of being watched grows stronger. There is no refuge from the glowing eyes that eventually pierce the darkness, two orbs of burning light that seem to float, detached but filled with an intelligence that chills to the core. The monster doesn't attack right away. It toys with its prey, moving just out of reach, its shadowy legs flickering like smoke in the dim light. Steps quicken into a frantic run, but the creature never falls behind. Instead, it seems to grow closer with every frantic breath, every panicked turn of the head. It doesn't just chase, it wears down the spirit, feeding on fear and despair. And the worst part? The forest has no end. The chase continues until exhaustion overtakes the hunted, and by then, the creature's fiery eyes are all that remain, burning like embers in the all-consuming dark. Legends of the forest have circulated for generations, whispered by locals who dare not enter certain areas. One such place is the Forbidden Grove, a section of the woods said to be cursed. Stories speak of strange noises, inexplicable disappearances, and an overwhelming sense of dread that drives even the bravest explorers away. The grove is marked by unnatural silence. Even the birds refuse to sing, and the wind avoids this stretch of trees. The ground is soft, almost sponge-like, as though it's been soaked with centuries of decay. At the heart of the grove lies an ancient marking, etched into the ground, a sigil of unknown origin, pulsating faintly with an otherworldly glow. Crossing the sigil's boundary triggers the awakening of something terrible. The shadows lengthen unnaturally, crawling up the trees as though alive. From within the darkness, the monster emerges. Its legs seem to materialize from the shadows themselves, impossibly long and serpentine, moving with a terrifying grace. The eyes are the last thing to appear, burning red and filled with a rage that transcends human comprehension. The grove is not just its territory, it is its domain, its hunting ground. There is no escaping once the creature has been disturbed. It stalks relentlessly, blending seamlessly into the shadows, its burning eyes the only clue to its position until it's too late. Daylight offers no safety in this forest. The trees cast long shadows that seem to stretch and move on their own, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. At first, it seems like a trick of the light. But as the sun dips lower in the sky, the movements become deliberate. The shadows converge, growing darker and more solid, until they take on a humanoid form. The creature emerges from the shifting darkness, its legs indistinguishable from the shadows that birthed it. It glides forward, silent and predatory, its movements unnatural and hypnotic. The glowing eyes are its most terrifying feature, burning like molten coals. They lock onto their prey with an intensity that freezes blood. No matter where one turns, the shadows shift to block, escape, herding the victim deeper into the forest. The trees themselves seem complicit, their branches forming barriers, funneling the terrified wanderer toward the monster. The forest becomes a labyrinth of shadows, and the monster is its architect. Its presence is suffocating, a darkness so thick it feels alive. Even when it's not visible, The burning eyes linger. In the mind, a haunting reminder that escape is impossible. The shadows are no longer a hiding place, they are the creature's domain. The feeling of being watched begins as soon as one steps into the forest. It's subtle at first, a tingling on the back of the neck, an unshakable sense of unease. But as the day progresses, the sensation grows stronger, becoming an oppressive force that cannot be ignored. The eyes are the first to appear. High in the treetops, they burn like fire, unwavering and predatory. They watch every move, following with an intensity that makes the skin crawl. The creature remains hidden at first, letting its gaze do the work of unnerving its prey. As the forest deepens, the monster reveals itself in glimpses. A shadow darting between trees. A faint rustle that shouldn't be there. The flicker of legs so dark they seem to absorb light. The eyes, however, are constant, always watching, always burning. The forest seems alive, its every sound amplified, its every shadow concealing a potential threat. And then, the creature steps fully into view. Its shadowy legs move with an unnatural fluidity, defying the laws of physics. The burning eyes lock onto their target, and the hunt begins. There is no logic to its movements, no pattern to its pursuit. The creature is everywhere and nowhere, a phantom in the trees. The only certainty is its intent to consume, to destroy, to claim its victim as another secret of the forest. The forest is crisscrossed with trails, but one path stands out, a narrow track lined with strange symbols carved into the bark of trees. The markings are deep and precise, as though made by claws rather than tools. The path seems to lead nowhere, twisting and turning in nonsensical directions. Following the path feels wrong, but an inexplicable force compels one to continue. The deeper one goes, the darker the forest becomes, until even the daylight is consumed by shadow. The symbols grow more frequent, their patterns becoming chaotic, almost frantic, as though warning of something ahead. Then, the monster appears. Its shadowy legs emerge first, impossibly long and disturbingly thin. Moving with a silent, predatory grace, the eyes follow, burning, unblinking, filled with an ancient malice. The creature doesn't attack immediately. Instead, it seems to savor the fear, stalking from a distance, its burning gaze never breaking. The path becomes a trap, its turns leading only to more darkness, more danger. The markings no longer guide, they mock, showing that escape was never an option. The forest becomes a prison, and the monster its warden. Its legs, made of pure shadow, move faster than the eye we can follow, closing the distance in an instant. The burning eyes are the last thing seen before the forest reclaims its prey. The forest is dark, but this darkness is not natural. Even in broad daylight, the shadows stretch, longer than they should, creeping unnaturally over the ground like tendrils of ink. Something about the way they move feels deliberate, alive. It starts small, a branch swaying without wind, a shadow darting across the ground with no apparent source. As dusk falls, the phenomenon intensifies. The shadows grow thicker, clustering together to form shapes that should not exist. A silhouette detaches itself from the others, impossibly tall and unnervingly thin. Its legs are like columns of smoke, shifting and rippling with every step, but its movements are silent, eerily so. It doesn't make a sound as it glides forward, emerging from the writhing darkness. Its burning eyes appear last, piercing the oppressive blackness with an unnatural, fiery glow. They are not just lights, they are alive, seething with a hatred that seems to bore into the soul. The creature's form is never entirely solid, flickering between shadow and substance, but its presence is undeniable. The forest itself seems to bow to its will. The trees sway as though they are alive, blocking paths that once seemed clear. The ground shifts subtly, tripping anyone who dares to run. The shadows move with purpose, circling and closing in, forcing the intruder toward the monster. The fiery gaze never wavers, watching with cruel delight as the forest becomes a prison. Escape is futile. The living shadows are everywhere, and the creature commands them. It doesn't chase, it waits, knowing there is no way out. The burning eyes are the last thing anyone sees before the darkness consumes them entirely. The discovery of an old lantern in the forest seems innocuous, at first a relic of a time long past. Its glass is cracked, and its metal is rusted, but when night falls, the lantern begins to glow faintly, as though something within it has been awakened. The light is pale and unnatural, casting long, flickering shadows that seem to dance and twist of their own accord. Carrying the lantern feels both comforting and unnerving. It pushes back the immediate darkness, but the shadows it creates are alive, moving independently of their source. Each step into the forest feels heavier, as though the lantern is pulling its bearer deeper into a place they were never meant to go. Then come the eyes. At first they are distant, faint pinpricks of light in the farthest reaches of the forest. But as the lantern's glow strengthens, so do the eyes. They burn brighter with each passing moment, watching, waiting. The shadowy form of the monster begins to take shape, a towering figure with legs that seem to float rather than walk, shifting in and out of visibility like smoke caught in a breeze. The lantern's glow becomes a double-edged sword. It illuminates the immediate area but also draws the creature closer, as though the light is a beacon summoning it from the depths of the forest. The burning eyes are no longer distant, they are everywhere, surrounding the intruder, closing in. The lantern flickers, its light growing erratic. Shadows dance wildly, and the monster moves faster, its shadowy legs flickering like flames in the wind. The lantern's glow finally dies, plunging the forest into complete darkness, leaving only the fiery gaze of the monster to light the way to oblivion. Legends warn of the forest's hunting grounds, a place where the trees grow unnaturally close, and the canopy above blocks out all but the faintest slivers of light. Entering this territory is said to awaken something ancient and malevolent, a creature that exists solely to hunt. The signs are subtle at first. The air grows colder, the sounds of the forest chirping birds, rustling leaves fade into silence. The ground underfoot feels softer, almost as if it's been churned by countless footsteps. The trees bear claw marks, deep gouges that suggest something with immense power moves through this area. The first sighting of the monster is fleeting. A flicker of movement in the corner of the eye. A shadow that doesn't belong. Its legs, impossibly long and thin, seem to dissolve into the forest floor with every step. Its eyes, however, are unmistakable, two burning orbs that glow with a predatory hunger. The forest itself becomes hostile, conspiring with the creature to disorient and trap its prey. Trails loop back on themselves, leading nowhere. Branches reach out like grasping fingers, snagging clothing and skin. The sense of being watched is overwhelming, but turning to confront the stalker only reveals more shadows. The hunt is a slow, methodical game. The creature doesn't rush, it doesn't need to. It knows the forest better than any human could, and it uses this knowledge to its advantage. The burning eyes remain ever present, growing brighter as the hunted grows weaker. There is no escape. From the territory it belongs to the monster, and those who enter are nothing more than prey. Deep, deep within the heart of the forest lies a place untouched by time, where ancient relics are hidden among the roots of gnarled trees. This is the domain of the forest's keeper, a shadowy figure said to guard the secrets of the woods with a relentless ferocity. The first sign of its presence is the unnatural stillness. Even the wind refuses to disturb this sacred ground. The air feels thick, heavy with an unspoken warning. As the sun sets, the shadows begin to move, coalescing into a humanoid form with legs that ripple like liquid. Darkness. The creature's eyes burn brighter than any fire, twin beacons of malice that illuminate the forest floor. Its form is both solid and incorporeal, shifting between states as it moves. The keeper is bound to the relics it protects, but it is also bound to destroy anyone who dares approach them. The forest itself acts as an extension of the keeper's will. Paths close behind intruders, trapping them within an ever-tightening circle. The trees groan and creak as if alive, their roots twisting to block escape. The relics, though tantalizingly close, remain out of reach, guarded by the fiery gaze of the keeper. The monster's movements are deliberate, almost ritualistic. It doesn't rush to attack, but instead stalks its prey, feeding on their fear. The burning eyes never blink, never falter, a constant reminder of the doom that awaits. To defy the keeper is to face the wrath of the forest itself, a fate from which there is no return. The forest was quiet now. The fire in the sky had long since faded, and the only light left was the faint, flickering glow of the embers among the trees. They pulsed like dying stars, small at first, but slowly growing brighter, more concentrated, until they formed eyes. Not eyes like a person's. These were flames, burning with an unnatural hunger. They glared at Irma from the depths of the dark, burning with a malicious awareness, like they had known me forever. And as those eyes fixed on me, something inside my chest tightened. The air grew thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like it could be my last. I turned, but my feet were frozen in place. The ground, soft and wet, seemed to pulse beneath me as if the earth itself was alive with hunger. My legs wouldn't move, and every part of my body screamed at me to run, but something in the air held me still, trapped. Then, from the darkness it came. The monster. Its legs, black as pitch, shifted in the shadows. With impossible speed, longer than should have been possible for anything on 2 feet. Slithered across the forest floor, its body stretching and warping like a nightmare made flesh. The shadowy limbs were an extension of the night itself, blending into the darkness but still moving with terrifying purpose. Its form was indistinct, its outline flickering like smoke, but those burning eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, relentless. I felt it before I saw it a presence. It was pulling me, dragging me towards it with a force that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. No matter how much I tried to resist, it was as if the darkness itself wrapped around me, tightening its grip, drawing me closer. Every step I tried to take in the opposite direction only made me stumble further into its path. The world around me grew darker still, the trees closing in, their branches reaching out like claws, each one a warning of what was to come. And then, the creature's legs were there, moving faster than anything could follow. I could hear its breathing, or was it my own? Quick and panicked, pounding in my ears. I didn't know. The only thing I knew was that it was too late. The burning eyes came closer. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, swallowed, erased by the oppressive silence that hung over the forest. My vision blurred as the darkness closed in, and I felt the cold, grasping fingers of the forest curl around me. The creature's presence was all-consuming, and as the flames in its eyes grew, I knew deep down, I knew I would never escape. And then, it stopped. A whisper of faint breath brushed against my ear. You can never leave. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. The forest seemed to breathe with me, as though it shared the same cursed heartbeat. The flames of its eyes flared, and just when I thought I might break, when I thought the forest itself might swallow me whole, it was gone. I stumbled to the ground, gasping for air. I couldn't tell if I had passed out or if I was still trapped in its grip. But something had changed. I felt different. The forest was silent now, but in that silence, I felt the weight of its watchfulness. The eyes were gone, but I knew they were still there somewhere, watching, waiting. I stumbled back toward the edge of the woods, my feet dragging, my mind struggling to grasp what had happened. But when I reached the clearing, when I thought I had made it, I turned around, only to find the ground behind me marked. A single smoldering ember lay at my feet, a silent reminder of what I had escaped, or thought I had. The flames flickered, and I swear I saw the outline of legs, shadowy and long, shift in the distance. Was it truly over, or had I merely been marked for the next time it came for me? The darkness never really leaves the forest, not when it's been claimed. And somewhere out There, in the spaces between shadows, I know it waits. If you dare, share this story, but remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you certain you're alone? Or are the shadows watching, waiting for you too? I had no idea what I was hearing at first. The scratching, the low growls echoing through the trees until I saw it. The beast outside, standing in the moonlight, its legs streaked with dirt and blood, eyes glistening with malice. It wasn't just waiting. I watched it. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't alone. It started with a faint rustling, the kind you hear when wind blows through dry leaves. But the wind wasn't blowing. Not that night. I'd only been living in the old house for a week, having moved in to escape the constant noise and bustle of the city. Nestled on the outskirts of town, it was supposed to be the perfect getaway. But, as it often happens with these things, the peace was short-lived. The first night, I thought it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. The house, old as it was, creaked and groaned in the wind. I tried to fall asleep, but the scratching sound grew louder, more deliberate, like something was trying to dig its way into the house. At first, I ignored it. It had to be an animal. But then, I heard something else. A low growl that chilled me to the bone. It didn't sound like a coyote or a raccoon. It was far deeper, more guttural, almost human. I tried to brush it off, pulling the covers over my head and hoping it was just my imagination. But the scratching continued, the growling not far behind. My pulse quickened, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. And then I heard it, a loud thud. It was followed by a scrape. Something was at the window. I didn't dare move. My heart thudded in my chest, and I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a tree branch had hit the window. But the sound persisted, growing more intense. Something was out there waiting. Slowly, I slid out of bed and crept toward the window, cautiously pulling back the curtains just enough to see. At first, I didn't see anything, but then my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, and I saw it, a dark, hulking figure standing near the edge of the yard, just beyond the pool of light from the porch lamp. The creature was massive, its body hunched low to the ground. Its legs were covered in streaks of dirt, as though it had been crawling through the mud. And its eyes, oh God, its eyes, they glistened in the darkness like pools of liquid malice, fixed directly on me. The creature didn't move, not at first. It simply stood there, watching, as though it had been waiting for me to notice it. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and predatory. Then, as if sensing my fear, it made a slow, deliberate movement toward the house, each step heavy and deliberate. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt frozen to the spot. I should have locked the door, pulled the curtains closed, done anything to stop it from getting closer. But I was too terrified to move, paralyzed by the intensity of its gaze. The growl started again, low and rumbling. As the creature began to stalk forward, its movements unnervingly silent for something of its size. Creepy. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a harsh scraping sound. It was as if the creature was dragging its claws across the ground, scraping against the dirt like a wild animal sharpening its teeth. Then, it stopped, right at the foot of the stairs leading up to the porch. I could see the gleam of its eyes in the darkness, and I realized that the creature wasn't just outside anymore, it was waiting, watching. I didn't know what it wanted, but I had a terrible feeling that I was the one it had been waiting for. My mind raced. I had to get out of there. I turned to run, but my feet tangled in the carpet, and I fell to the ground with a thud. The noise echoed through the house. For a moment, I held my breath, praying that the creature hadn't heard me. But just as I was about to get up, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the porch. The door handle rattled. The creature was trying to get inside. I scrambled to my feet and bolted toward the back door, my heart pounding in my chest. Fumbled with the locks, but my hands were shaking so violently that it took far too long to unlock the door. When I finally yanked it open, I was met with an eerie silence. The creature was no longer there. But the terror didn't subside. I knew, deep down, that it hadn't left. It was out there, watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I ran to the woods behind the house, my only thought being to put as much distance between myself and the creature as possible. But the more I ran, the more I felt the presence of something else, something larger, something older. I could hear faint growls in the distance, but they weren't the same as the one from the yard. This was something far deeper. I was being hunted. As I reached the edge of the forest, I realized I wasn't just dealing with one creature. I was surrounded. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or monsters, but when I moved into the old cabin on the edge of the forest, something changed. The house was isolated, the nearest neighbor miles away, and I figured the solitude would help me clear my mind. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first night was uneventful, but soon enough, strange things began to happen. The floorboards creaked in the middle of the night, and the walls groaned as if the house was alive. I convinced myself it was the wind, or the house settling. But then came the noises. Every night, without fail, I'd hear them. Scratching at the door. A low growl that seemed to be coming from just outside the house. At first I thought it was animals, raccoons, foxes maybe. Even a bear, but then I began to feel a presence outside, watching. The growls got louder, more distinct. Each night, the creature seemed to come closer, its presence growing stronger. I tried to ignore it. After all, what else could it be? But then, one evening, while sitting by the fire, I heard something else, a voice. Soft, almost a whisper. Carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the urgency in the voice. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. The next night, I decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I stepped outside. The night air was crisp, the trees around me swaying in the breeze. But the stillness felt wrong, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I walked toward the edge of the yard, where the growls seemed to come from, and that's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness. The beast was waiting, its massive frame hidden in the shadows. It stood perfectly still, its legs streaked with dirt. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature didn't move, but its gaze felt like a weight, pressing down on me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the beast's eyes never leaving mine. I didn't know whether to run or stand my ground. The growl started again, lower this time, almost like a warning. The creature took a step forward, its long legs dragging against the earth. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind biting at my skin. The silence was deafening, and then it happened. The beast lunged forward with incredible speed, its claws scraping against the ground. I barely had time to react before it was on me, its hot breath like steam against my neck. But just before it reached me, something strange happened. It stopped. The creature didn't bite or claw. It simply stood there, watching me with its glowing eyes. I was paralyzed, unable to move as the creature seemed to weigh my every action. I realized then that it wasn't just a beast. It was something far older, something that had been waiting for me. I tried to back away slowly, but the creature didn't move. I could feel its gaze following me, its malice permeating the air. The growl started again, but it wasn't directed at me. It was more like a warning, a signal to something or someone else. As I stepped back into the house, the creature made no move to follow. It just stood there, watching from the darkness. The cold feeling in my chest didn't go away. It had been watching for longer than I had known, and I had no idea why. I locked the door and retreated to my room, but sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's glowing eyes staring back at me, its malice waiting to swallow me whole. The next morning, I left the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, waiting, watching. The small town of Redwood Falls had always seemed like a picturesque escape. Nestled between thick forests, it offered the quiet solitude I had been yearning for. I had moved here with the hope of starting fresh, leaving behind the chaos of the city, the heartbreak of my past. The house I rented was an old Victorian on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a dense forest that had always intrigued me. The locals spoke of the woods in hushed tones, warning newcomers to avoid wandering too far. But I wasn't easily frightened, and I brushed off their warnings as superstitious nonsense. The first few days were peaceful. The town was friendly, the air crisp, and the nights were filled with the sounds of nature. But then things began to change. On the fourth night, the strange sound started. At first, it was a soft rustling, like someone or something was moving through the trees. I dismissed it as the wind, though the wind didn't sound like that. It wasn't until the growls started, deep and resonating, that I began to feel uneasy. They weren't the growls of any animal I recognized, not even the distant howl of a wolf. These were much deeper, more primal. Each night, the sounds became louder. They started just after sunset and continued well into the early morning. Scratching at the windows, low growls coming from the shadows of the trees, as if something was just outside my reach, watching. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, or perhaps a bear rummaging through the brush. But then I heard something that stopped me cold: whispers. The whispers were faint at first, just barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But over the course of the week, they grew clearer, more distinct. At first, they sounded like words, but the language was foreign to me. I couldn't make them out, but there was a sense of urgency in the tone. I would lie in bed, wide awake, the whispers growing louder, and with them came the scratching sounds. It wasn't the wind anymore. Someone was out there, deliberately trying to get my attention. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the back door, stepping into the darkness. The air was thick and cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled with unease. I shined the flashlight into the trees, but all I saw were the dark, swaying silhouettes of branches. The whispers grew louder as I ventured further, the scratching sounds following me. Eason. I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. It was there, yet I saw it. The beast. It was massive, its body hunched low to the ground, its legs covered in dirt and mud. Its eyes glowed, a sickly yellow, and they fixed on me with an intensity that froze mine in place. The air around it was thick with malice, and the whispers seemed to be coming from all directions now, swirling around me like an invisible fog. The creature made no move to approach me, but it didn't need to. Its gaze was enough to paralyze me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature that stood before me. Its growl was low, rumbling from deep within its chest, like the growl of something ancient, something not of this world. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to back away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The whispers died down as well, leaving nothing but silence. But the silence was worse than the sounds. It was as if the very air had thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the weight of the creature's gaze, even though it was gone. Something had been watching me, and it hadn't left. I stumbled back toward the house, my heart racing in my chest. I could hear the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. I knew then that I wasn't alone. The creature wasn't just a beast. It was part of something much larger, something that had existed in the woods for far longer than I had. The forest had a life of its own, and I had become a part of it, whether I liked it or not. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees outside sent me into a panic. I could feel the creature's presence, even though I couldn't see it. It was out there, watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The whispers filled my ears, growing louder until I couldn't hear anything else. I was no longer just an observer in the forest, I was a part of its story, and it wasn't going to let me go. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay there anymore. The forest had claimed me, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever truly leave. But the worst part was the realization that the creature hadn't gone. It was still out there, waiting, watching. I could feel its eyes on me as I drove away, a lingering presence that would follow me for the rest of my life. There was something wrong with the town of Willow Creek. I didn't know what it was at first, but the more I stayed, the more I could feel it. The townspeople were kind enough, but there was a nervousness in their eyes, a fear they tried to mask with smiles. I thought it was just my imagination. But when I started hearing the stories of something lurking in the woods, just beyond the town, I began to wonder. One night, after several weeks of strange occurrences, I ventured into the woods. I had to know what was out there. The growls I'd heard from the edge of the forest were too unsettling to ignore, and I was tired of the fear gnawing at me. I grabbed a flashlight and set off into the darkness, hoping to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was a bear or some wild animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The deeper I went into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the moonlight, and the air grew thick with an unnatural silence. I could still hear the growls, now louder, closer. They seemed to come from all directions, as if the very forest itself was alive. I pressed on, determined to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw a shape moving through the trees. It was massive, its silhouette barely discernible in the darkness, but I could make out the glint of its eyes. I froze, my heart racing. The creature didn't move toward me, but it didn't take its eyes off me either. There was something unnervingly intelligent about the way it watched me, as if it knew exactly what I was thinking. The growl grew louder, more insistent. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, and the air seemed to grow colder. I took a step back, but the creature didn't react. It just stood there, waiting, watching. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on something, a root, a rock, I wasn't sure. I stumbled. And in that split second, the creature moved. It was so fast, so sudden, that I didn't have time to react. Its growl reverberated in my chest, its massive form closing in on me. But just as quickly it stopped. The creature stood motionless, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It wasn't attacking, it was waiting. The growl had stopped, and all I could hear was the beating of my own heart. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, paralyzed. The creature's gaze was unblinking, its malice palpable in the air. I knew that if it chose to attack, I wouldn't stand a chance. The creature didn't attack. Instead, it simply watched. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there in silence, until I finally managed to break free of its gaze and retreat slowly. I didn't dare turn my back on it, and every step I took was another reminder of how much danger I was in. The creature never followed me, but I knew it was still out there, watching. I didn't understand it, but I knew that I was not welcome in its domain. The town had warned me, and now I understood why. I left Willow Creek soon after that night, but the memories lingered. The beast still watches from the darkness of the forest, its eyes fixed on anyone who dares to venture too close. And I can never forget the weight of its gaze, the terrible sense that it was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I didn't believe in ghosts or legends, but when I inherited my grandmother's old house deep in the woods, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. The house was isolated, tucked away in a dense forest that felt as if it had a life of its own. The locals didn't speak of it, often, but when they did, it was always in whispers. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of creatures lurking in the trees, watching. At first I ignored the stories, thinking they were just the ramblings of people who had lived too close to the woods for too long. But it wasn't long before I began to hear the strange sounds. It started with a rustling in the trees, followed by low growls and the unmistakable sound of something moving just beyond my vision. It wasn't animals, at least, not any animals I recognized. The sounds grew louder each night, and soon, the forest felt as though it was closing in around the house. I tried to keep busy, telling myself it was just my imagination, but something in the air was different. It was thick, heavy, as if the woods themselves were watching me. One evening, after a particularly unnerving growl, I decided to investigate. I took a flashlight and stepped into the forest. The shadows were long and twisted, the trees creaking in the wind. But then I heard it scratching, like claws against bark. I turned, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. That's when I saw it. The beast. It was massive, standing tall and still, its eyes glowing in the dark. Its legs were streaked with dirt, its body hulking and covered in grime. It didn't move, but its gaze was fixed on me. I froze, my body paralyzed by its presence. The growl came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command. The beast stepped forward, its huge frame towering over me. I felt a wave of dread wash over me as I realized I was no longer alone in the woods. There were more of them, their eyes gleaming in the darkness, their shapes shifting in the shadows. The creature circled me, its gaze never leaving mine. I tried to move, but I was rooted to the spot. It wasn't attacking, but it wasn't letting me go either. I understood, in that moment, that I wasn't meant to leave. The shadows were their home, and I was just an intruder. It had been years since I'd last seen the town of Black Hollow. My parents had left when I was young, and I had no real memories of the place, only the stories they'd told me. The stories about the dark woods that bordered the town, the mysterious disappearances, and the whispers of something unnatural lurking in the trees. I didn't believe in any of it, of course, but when I inherited my grandparents' old farmhouse, I decided to return. I figured I could finally lay to rest the strange stories that had haunted my childhood. The house was far more isolated than I'd expected. The forest seemed to stretch for miles in every direction, its dense trees forming a near impenetrable barrier around the property. The first few days were quiet, too quiet. But that's when the first odd thing happened. At dusk, I began to hear strange noises coming from the woods. I tried to dismiss them at first, telling myself it was just animals moving through the underbrush. But the more I heard them, the more I felt a growing sense of unease. The sounds weren't normal. They were too deliberate, too unnatural. The first night I heard it clearly. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the edge of the forest, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the trees. It was as though the creature knew exactly where I was, and it was getting closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I immediately locked all the doors and windows. I wasn't about to let my guard down, but still, I felt the weight of the forest's presence pressing against the walls of my home. Over the next few days, the sounds grew louder, scratching at the windows, growling just outside the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That something was waiting for me to step outside. But I wasn't foolish enough to do that. At least not yet. The growls were unlike anything I had ever heard, deeper, more resonant, like a predator toying with its prey. One evening, I finally gathered the courage to go outside. I couldn't stay locked in the house forever. I had to know what was causing the noises. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the woods. As soon as I crossed the threshold of the tree line, the air turned cold, and the whispers began. Soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but then they grew louder, more distinct. They weren't the sounds of animals or the wind. They were voices, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I pressed on, my flashlight cutting through the dark like a thin beam of hope. I could feel something out there watching. It wasn't until I reached the edge of a small clearing that I saw it, a massive shape hunched low to the ground, its legs covered in dirt, its eyes gleaming like twin pools of malice. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen. It had the form of an animal, but its features were twisted, contorted, as though it had been shaped by something far darker than nature itself. The growl it emitted was not one of hunger, but of warning. A warning that sent chills through my spine. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by its gaze, its glowing eyes, locked onto mine as it stepped forward. Its body was covered in streaks of dirt, and it moved, with a strange, slow grace that made it all the more terrifying. As I backed away, the creature followed me, its presence looming behind me as I ran, but it never attacked. It simply watched. I stumbled back toward the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were still there, echoing in the trees, growing louder. I felt as though the forest itself was alive, closing in around me. Every rustle of the wind, every snapping of a twig made me jump. I had to get back, inside, away from whatever that thing was. But when I turned to look behind me, the creature was gone. It had vanished into the darkness, leaving only the weight of its presence behind. That night, I stayed awake, my eyes darting around the room, waiting for the creature to return. But it didn't. The sounds had stopped, and I convinced myself I had imagined it all. But deep down, I knew better. The forest was not done with me yet, and neither was the creature that lurked within it. The next morning, I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay there any longer. The forest had claimed me, and I wasn't sure if I would ever truly escape. But the worst part was knowing that the creature was still out there waiting, watching. The whispers still lingered in my mind, and I would never forget the eyes of that thing. The forest had a life of its own, and it would never let me forget what I had seen. I came to the small village of Greystone to investigate a series of strange disappearances. People had been vanishing without a trace, and the locals were starting to get nervous. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe a few people getting lost in the woods. But the more I talked to the villagers, the more I began to hear strange stories. They spoke of a creature that stalked the forest, a beast that only came out at night, its eyes glowing in the dark, watching. I wasn't sure what to believe. As a journalist, I had dealt with my fair share of bizarre stories, but this one seemed different. The town had been plagued by these disappearances for decades, and no one had ever been able to explain them. The townspeople were tight-lipped, and it wasn't until I met an old man who had lived there his entire life that I began to understand the truth. He told me about the creature, how it would silently watch from the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. According to the old man, the beast was always watching, always waiting. But it didn't kill right away. It took its time, learning the patterns of its prey, waiting until they were vulnerable. And when the time came, it would strike, dragging its victim into the woods, never to be seen again. I didn't believe him at first. I thought it was just an old man's ramblings. But that night I decided to see for myself. I ventured into the woods with nothing but a flashlight and my camera. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked deeper into the forest. And then I heard a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned off the flashlight and listened. The growl was followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I could feel its presence, like a shadow lurking, just beyond my vision. It was watching me. I knew it. I took a step forward, then another, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The creature was close. I raised the camera, trying to capture anything that might be lurking in the shadows. And then, through the trees, I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes fixed on me with unblinking intensity. I froze. The beast was massive, its body hidden in the darkness, but its eyes gleamed with a predatory gleam that chilled me to the core. It was watching, waiting. The growl echoed again, louder this time, as if warning me to stay away. I took a step back, but the creature didn't move. It didn't need to. I slowly turned and began to retreat, my footsteps quickening as the growl grew louder, more insistent. It was following me, staying just out of sight, but its presence was undeniable. The forest seemed alive with the sound of its movements, the rustling of leaves and the cracking of branches. I didn't know how long I could keep running. My breath was ragged and my heart was racing, but I couldn't stop. I had to get out of there. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I turned around and looked back. The creature was gone, but I could still feel its eyes on me, watching from the trees. I had no idea what it was, or why it had let me go, but I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't finished with me. The next morning, I packed my things and left Greystone. The creature was still out there, watching, waiting for its next victim. And I knew that I would never forget the feeling of those eyes on me, following me through the forest, waiting for the right moment to strike. I moved to the village of Hilltop to start over. The quiet life, away from the noise of the city, was supposed to help me heal. But the moment I arrived, something felt off. The villagers were kind, but there was an unease beneath their smiles. They were always looking over their shoulders, always glancing toward the woods. It wasn't until I began to hear the whispers that I realized something darker was at work. The woods surrounding Hilltop were thick and dense, full of secrets that no one ever spoke of. They said the forest was cursed, but I dismissed it as superstition. That is, until the first night I heard the growl. It came from the trees, deep and rumbling, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I thought it was a bear at first, but the growl was different. It was more like a warning, like something larger than any animal I'd ever encountered. That night I couldn't sleep. The sounds continued, scratching at the window, growling just beyond the door. I tried to ignore it, but the fear began to seep in. The forest was alive, and something was out there, waiting. I decided to investigate. I took my flashlight and ventured into the woods. The night was dark, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence. I could feel something watching me, but I couldn't see it. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches creaking in the wind. And then I saw it. The creature. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, its form barely visible but massive. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence felt in every crackling branch. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the creature watched me. It made no sound, only its eyes, glistening with malice. My heart raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from its gaze. It didn't attack, but I could feel its hunger, its predatory instinct waiting for the perfect moment. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature didn't follow, but I knew it. It was still out there, watching. I would never forget those eyes, and the sense that I was not meant to leave the forest. When I first came to the town of Thornbrook, I didn't know about the forest. I didn't know about the disappearances, the rumors, or the warnings. All I knew was that the house was cheap, and the town seemed peaceful enough. But soon after I arrived, I began to hear the whispers. They started as faint voices in the wind, but they grew louder every night. I ignored them at first, thinking it was just my imagination. But then the growls began, deep, terrifying sounds that shook the very earth beneath my feet. They were coming from the forest. I decided to investigate, hoping to uncover the source of the sounds. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I could hear the growls getting closer, the sounds of something large moving through the forest. I saw the creature just beyond the trees, its massive form barely visible in the shadows. Its eyes glowing with an otherworldly malice. It watched me, its gaze piercing into my soul. I realized then that the creature was not just a predator, it was part of the curse that had been placed upon the forest. The growls were its way of warning me. And now, I was part of the curse, too. The creature didn't approach, but I could feel its presence, lingering in the shadows. The whispers surrounded me, filling my mind with a sense of dread. The forest wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it had claimed me as its own. I ran back to the house, but I knew that the curse had already begun. The creature was waiting for me to return. And no matter how far I ran, it would always be out there watching, waiting for its next victim. The air around me felt thick with the weight of inevitability, the moonlight casting a ghostly glow over the beast that stood before me. It didn't move, but I could feel the malice, the ancient hunger, rolling off of it like waves of heat. Its eyes were still locked onto mine, empty, burning, with the sorrow of centuries, and the whispers in the trees grew louder, like a chorus of the damned, urging me to make a choice. "You can't break the pact," it said, its voice rasping like dry leaves scraping against a stone. "Your bloodline made it. You're bound to it, whether you like it or not." I tried to speak, but my throat tightened as though the forest itself was squeezing the words from me. The beast moved slightly, its claws scraping the earth, and I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. The ground felt like it was slipping from under me. The world around me, the house, the forest, the night itself was warping, pressing in. It wasn't just the creature I feared anymore. It was the forest, the curse that clung to it, the way it wrapped its gnarled branches around my very soul, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The trees weren't just silent witnesses to this hellish pact, they were alive. They knew me. They had always known me. My ancestors had sealed my fate with their blood, their silent screams embedded in the very soil beneath my feet. They had promised my soul in exchange for power, protection. Now, as the beast loomed closer, the truth became clear. There was no escape. The curse didn't need my consent, it had already claimed me. The creature's grin widened, and it stepped forward, its massive form blotting out the stars. Could see it clearly now, its dirt-streaked legs, twisted and broken, crawling forward like some unholy parody of man. It hadn't been human for centuries. And yet, in its eyes, I saw the reflection of something that was once like me, a person who had made a pact and paid the price. "Do you feel it?" it asked, its voice a low growl. The pull? The hunger. I couldn't breathe. I was suffocating, not just from the air but from the realization that there was no fight left to be had. The woods were closing in, the trees bending and reaching like gnarled hands, their twisted fingers curling toward me. The beast wasn't the only one watching, it was all of them. The earth beneath my feet began to rumble. The forest seemed to shift, its roots groaning like a wounded animal. I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that the pact wasn't just a chain that bound me, it was a sentence. A sentence that would not only consume my flesh but my soul, as it had done to so many before me. The creature reaches out a hand, its claws scraping the air with a terrible sound, and I knew it was too late. I had no power here, no freedom. This was it, the last breath of a family lost to an ancient, unbreakable curse. Just as its hand was about to touch my chest, a whisper passed through the air, sharp and cold, as though it came from the very heart of the forest. "There is always another." The words were enough to freeze me, to paralyze me. But then the darkness shifted. Again, something more sinister was rising from the earth itself, twisting, writhing like a hidden nightmare trying to claw its way into the waking world. Suddenly, the beast's grip loosened, and its gaze flickered toward something in the distance, something new, something worse. The ground trembled again, but this time it was not just the forest. It was beneath it, the earth itself shifting, like the beginning of something far older, far darker. With one final, bone-chilling growl, the creature faded into the night, disappearing as quickly as It had appeared, leaving only its heavy presence behind. And in the distance I could still hear the faint sound of something scratching, moving, coming closer. I stood frozen in the middle of the clearing, my breath ragged, my skin cold with sweat. Whisper still echoed in my mind. There is always another. But what did it mean? What had been released from the earth, and how would I ever escape it? I turned back to the house. The doors were wide open, swinging in the breeze as if inviting me back inside. But there was something waiting there now, something new, something I wasn't sure I wanted to face. The shadows were darker than they had been before. The tree seemed to whisper more urgently now. It was then I understood I wasn't the only one bound to the pact. I ran back inside the house, slamming the door behind me, but the silence didn't come. Whispers were louder now, filling every corner of the room. Something was watching me. Something I couldn't see but could feel with terrifying clarity. I looked out the window to the woods beyond, and I swear I saw them. Shadows tall, twisting, impossible shapes moving between the trees. Eyes watching me from every angle. The forest was awake, and it was calling to me. The pact had not ended. It was only just beginning. As I stood there, staring into the darkness, I realized that this wasn't just my nightmare, it was ours. All of us. Every soul that had ever walked this earth, bound to the land, bound to the pact, bound to the creatures that had made their homes in the trees. And somewhere in the distance I could still hear the scraping, the growling, the whispering, and the voice that had haunted me from the beginning, now clearer than ever. There is always another. If you dare, pass this tale along, but beware, for every telling strengthens the curse. As you reach the end, ask yourself, are you truly alone, or is something silently waiting in the dark, just out of sight?